Hello everyone. I thought I would do a hopefully quick video today about the subject of fairy invisibility. And this is an interesting one because we see it a lot in modern, not only pop culture, but also sort of the modern understanding of fairies, that sort of Victorian, New Age influenced, postmodern, I don't know exactly the best way to categorize it, but middle class American popular understanding of fairies. There tends to be a lot of focus and emphasis on the idea of fairies being invisible, as beings that can't be seen by humans, and increasingly, at least in my experience, sort of wandering around the internet and different fairy enthusiast communities, the idea of fairies as entirely non-corporeal beings who occasionally can be perceived as manifesting in the form of lights. Sort of like the idea of ghost hunters photographing orbs, something along those lines, but little glowing balls of light would be what fairies are perceived as. And this is a lot to unpack, and I'm going to try to keep it fairly quick, even though it's sort of a big topic, because there's a lot of layers to this, and there's some true older folklore in it, and there's also a lot of, I don't necessarily say misunderstandings, but modern reinterpretations. We'll put it that way. So, to begin with, this concept of fairies as invisible and intangible entities, I think is sort of a confluence of two different things. I think on the one hand, it's a little bit of a conflation of the idea of fairies being invisible, the invisibility of fairies with the incorporeality of fairies. And those are actually two very separate topics. They're not the same thing. The idea that just because humans can't see fairies means that fairies inherently have no physical bodies, although they often now are understood as being the same thing, are actually two different subjects. And that's coming from the folkloric perspective. In folklore, the idea that fairies are invisible, or that humans are unable to see fairies, is something that is fairly well established. We can go all the way back to the 9th century Irish story, the Echtra Conla, Adventures of Conla, which is dated to the 9th century, but probably as an oral story goes back to at least the 7th. Some scholars sort of theorize potentially back to the 5th. I don't know. Anytime you're dating a written story back to its oral origins, if you will, it gets a little theoretical. You're basing it on the language that's used in the written version. So I don't know, I think the 7th is probably a safe bet, but either way, it is actually the oldest written Irish story that we have where we see fairies showing up. In the Echtra Conla, what we see is a woman of fairy who appears to Conla, who is the son of Con of the 100 Battles. When she first appears, and this is where the invisibility part shows up, Conla can see her, but no one else can. His father, who's standing right next to him, cannot see her. His father's druid cannot see her. None of his father's men, there's I think 50 of them standing around, cannot see her. But Conla can. In fact, he sees her and starts having a conversation with her, prompting his father to ask him, "Who are you talking to?" At which point he says, "This beautiful woman," and so the story goes. But the point here is that we see in this 9th century, potentially earlier, Irish mythological tale, the idea that a fairy woman, can appear to one person, can be seen by one person while being invisible to other human beings. And that is something that we find really across the bulk of folklore, not just Irish, but, fairy folklore in general. Mythology, folklore, anecdotal material. It's really a very pervasive concept that fairies can choose to be seen or choose not to be seen. Even within a group, they can choose one person to see them while everyone else in the group cannot see them. And again, I'm trying to keep this video short, so I'm not going to give a ton of examples here, or this is not going to be a short video, but we can find a lot of examples of this across a wide array of folklore. Particularly Irish, which again is my personal focus, so that's what I tend to fall back on. But you can find it in other cultural folklore as well. And one of the things that's important to understand with this is the idea that it's a magic, if you will, that's particular to the fairies, that they can pass unseen. And there's roots for this, again, in Irish mythology that explain it. Other cultures, I'm sure, have their own explanations for why the fairies can pass unseen to human eyes. There's also a concept in Irish and Scottish cultural belief of something called the second sight or spirit sight, which is particular humans who have the ability to see fairies, whether they want to be seen or not. It's kind of a dangerous ability. And there's more to second sight than just seeing fairies. I'm really oversimplifying it just for this particular video. It involves other things as well besides just this. But a lot of times when we read about particular people who are known to be friends of the fairies or to have connections to them, to relate events connected to them in the particular area they lived in. Not always, but in many cases it was a person who was known to have the second sight or have spirit sight who was able to see them. So this invisibility of the fairies is not a sort of universal, works on all humans kind of thing. But it is generally understood that they have this ability to pass unseen. And again, trying to keep this short, I'm not going to get in depth on where that comes from or why, but just sort of understand that it's found across folklore and it's understood that they can do this. Now, just because they can pass unseen, however, does not mean that they don't potentially have physical bodies. That's also a really complicated and deep topic to get into. It's sort of hard to put into a YouTube video without it turning into a 2-hour YouTube video. But suffice to say that, again, when we look across the bulk of folklore and anecdotal material, while we do certainly have some examples where it would seem like the good people do not have a tangible quality to them, we also have a wide array of material that indicates that they do. Whether they have a permanent tangible quality, whether they have a permanent physicality, that is sort of the continuously open debate question. Really just no one knows for sure. Going back all the way to the 17th century with Reverend Robert Kirk, who discusses this topic, people have gone back and forth about whether they can sometimes be physical and sometimes not be physical. Kirk's theory was that they had physical bodies that were like congealed clouds. Something like astral is one of the terms he used for them. Sort of implying that they can choose to pull together and be physical, or they can choose not to, which is how they can move around and pass through things or physically interact with the world. That is how we get into the sometimes they do have physical bodies part of this equation, is we have a lot of folklore and a lot of anecdotal material where the good people do, in fact, physically interact with not only human beings, but animals, inanimate objects, all sorts of different things. And this is definitely physical interaction. There's a case that you can read on the Dukas IE website, which I highly recommend. By the way, it's an excellent site. It's a collection that school children undertook the early 20th century to record different anecdotal material, different folklore, different stories from people living in all different parts of Ireland at that time. Anyway, but there's a story that's recounted there of a gentleman who was walking home, saw some fairies playing ball in a field, stopped to watch, which is never a good idea. They saw him watching them, called out to him. I believe in the account he either answered or acknowledged them in some way, and they basically responded by beating the snot out of him. He was beaten very, very badly. Beating the snot's not really a technical term, but they beat him very, very badly. And this was definitely a physical encounter, without any question. We see the same sorts of things where fairies respond violently and physically assault people in other stories. We also, of course, as I addressed in the very first YouTube video I ever made on fairies and sex, see many accounts of fairies either fathering children with humans or bearing children to humans, which at least implies some tangible physical interaction going on. Certainly the products of those unions were actual physical children in the folklore and the anecdotes. So that's a tangible physical body. I'm trying to think of some other good examples of tangible physical encounters with fairies, but there's so many of them across folklore. Obviously, in modern terms, some people discount a lot of this and try to find excuses for a lot of this and explanations for why people believed these things. I'm not judging the folkloric beliefs in any direction. I'm just presenting them as this is what people believe. This is the folklore as it's been passed down, and these are the anecdotal accounts as they exist. So, take them as they are, judge them however you want to judge them. But the belief has always been that fairies are capable of having physical bodies and also capable of being seen or unseen, usually at their own will. Sometimes humans are capable of seeing them, sometimes not. They often react very badly to being seen when they don't want to be seen. So, that all said, I said at the beginning that I think part of the confusion with all this comes in with people mistaking the invisibility of fairies with incorporeality of fairies, which is basically saying that people assume because fairies can't always be seen by humans that they therefore, much like a human ghost, must not have a physical body, and that's why they can't be seen. It's definitely not that simple in folklore. I think the folklore paints a much more complicated picture of what exactly is going on with the physicality of fairies. The answer to the invisibility seems to be that it's magic. They have a power called glamour, which influences people's perceptive abilities. There we go. And can cause humans to perceive anything that they want them to perceive. And this affects all 5 of the senses, not just vision, but it's particularly aimed at vision. And it's usually sort of understood that it's that ability, that power, that causes them to be able to be invisible. Not that they're literally invisible, but just that they can cause humans not to notice that they're there, if that makes sense to everyone. So I said at the beginning as well that I think there's two sort of things going on with the common modern perception that fairies are invisible because they don't have physical bodies and that they sort of exist as these little balls of light. I think that's definitely a big part of it, is confusing the invisibility for them just not having a body. I think the other part of it is this sort of idea that's coming about in the last 100, 150 years or so, coming in from foreign influences, theosophy, some of the Victorian era beliefs that have sort of pushed the concept of fairies into more of the category of spirit guides, the modern understanding of angels, which, much like the modern understanding of fairies, very, very different from the more traditional one. And these sorts of views really have sort of pushed them into this category of not having physical forms, not having physical bodies, effectively just being spirits in the sense of the way a human ghost is a spirit, that it's a soul that exists without a physical form. So I definitely understand why the modern perception is the way it is based on the different influences. The problem becomes that the folkloric understanding, the way they appear in folklore, and the way they appear in anecdotes, even up through the 21st century, is very, very different. We still see people having physical interactions with the good neighbors in anecdotes. We still have folklore up through the mid-20th century with people recounting very physical encounters with fairy beings. So really can't just flat out say that they do not have physical forms. We can say that we don't really understand the physical forms or how all of that works necessarily. The invisibility is certainly a bit of a separate but related issue, but seems not to hinge on the fact that they don't physically exist in our reality so much as that they are able to affect our perception in a way that hides them within our physical reality, if that makes sense. And again, this all gets into exactly what you believe. You sort of have to start from the premise that fairies exist, literally exist. If you're working from that belief system, then the idea that they exist in this world, that they're able to cloak their presence, literally, according to mythology, it's actually called a cloak. I'm trying to make a little joke there, little mythology joke. They're able to cloak their presence from humanity. It's not that much of a stretch. It doesn't make any more or less sense than the idea that they do not have corporeal reality and they're just entirely spirit beings. I tend to err on the side of not wanting to throw out thousands of years of folklore and belief and anecdotal material in favor of very recent, different understandings of who and what fairies are. So I lean towards the older beliefs that they are physical or can be physical, but that they also can pass invisibly by influencing human perception, if you will. So I'm coming up on 20 minutes. I don't want to go on too long about this. If anyone has any questions about fairies being invisible when they choose to be invisible, and I guess I kind of also got into the physical aspect, so physicality of fairies, throw that in too. Feel free to drop a question in the comments. I'll try to answer it. I guess the really short answer is that invisibility is something that they can choose, or they can choose to be seen. physically, tangibly seen in our world if they want to be. So it's a little food for thought to end this with. And again, you know, makes life a little more interesting if you consider that you potentially can see them and or meet them in this world if you believe in them to begin with. Or if you don't believe in them, you could still meet them, depending. Would you recognize them if you did? Probably a good question. So have a nice day, everyone. And once again, I'm going to start trying to make a few more videos again. So hopefully you found this one interesting.